Officially. Hello, Keegan from Alien Perspectives, and welcome on the Nexus. This is your first episode here. Thank you for dropping by, and let us get to know each other first. So,
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
first, not sure how I stumbled upon you. I think it was on Instagram actually, an app I have deinstalled since, but well, we got in touch, and from what I remember, so let me first introduce myself, right? I'm Mark. I am here in Bern. I am running the Nexus, the geopolitical podcast. Actually, it's meant as a general podcast, but it turns out it's gotten more into geopolitics than anything else. I guess it's a values thing, but we can talk about values as well. And I have also had a keen interest in psychology and I guess sociology because I see the two as intermeshed. We can get into that as well. I mean, I intend to get into that as well. And so I see a lot of this coming together, right? You have individual psychology, which sort of averages out into the zeitgeist or the culture of a people. And that then in turn guides political decisions, which then boils back into geopolitics and the likes, right? So it's fairly broad topic, but something like that. And then I stumbled upon you giving an interesting, I think it was a short, but not so short. I think it was several minutes long, and I can't tell you what exactly it was, but it was very close to what I wrote about as well, which is psychology in politics. So let me just throw the ball back at you, and you can introduce yourself and tell us where you're coming from and what your view is.
Yeah, so my name is Keegan. You can find me on any social media platform, TikTok, Instagram, even Facebook and YouTube at Keegan Tatum. That's Keegantatum. I talk almost exclusively about the psychology of politics, so the neurological differences between people on the right and left, the perceptual differences, the personality differences, and the general psychology differences. I'm particularly interested in what motivates people to have particular views. And so I might talk about emotional intelligence or other forms of intelligence, brain differences, so on. I come at this from a political science angle. So I do not have a background in like clinical mental health or anything like that. It's all political psychology, which is a branch of social psychology.
Thank you. Well, that makes the two of us being amateurs in this sense because I come from physics, and
Hey.
my and my knowledge, if inexpert though it may be, comes from books, and I've covered actually a lot from I don't know Carl Jung all the way to Jordan Peterson or um, Daniel Goleman or Kahneman, and so you go from system one and two, intuition versus the actual cognitive thinking, emotional intelligence, which is Daniel Goleman, and many others. You know the classics, and then also the let me call them biased actors like Jordan Peterson and
Oh,
others.
come
So
on, Jordan Peterson. He's just out for information. No, come on, man. He's totally I'm not going to have Jordan Peterson be mocked or ridiculed in my presence, sir.
I mean, no, he's amazing. To be fair, it's just I have,
I'm not a fan.
yeah, I used to be actually. I believe that even though I don't largely agree with his views nowadays, I must say I think he did contribute a lot to me getting into this space, perhaps podcasting too, because the way it started for me is actually started way before, but the way it started for me is at some point I started writing down counter arguments because I figured, you have this massive, towering intellectual out there who has under his belt probably thousands of books. Who am I to argue? And yet, this argument don't make sense. Logically, it's easily refuted. Factually, sometimes it's easily refuted. And so I started writing down counter arguments until it started becoming I don't know, you can call it an ideology, a value system, something that might turn into a book someday. But yeah, so anyways, yeah, both of us are amateurs, so to say, in this domain. I mean, we're not professionals. That's what I mean. At least we don't work in psychology.
I
Nonetheless,
don't
I
work
don't
in
think.
psychology, but I do have a master's degree in political science, and one of my focuses was political psychology. So,
Okay,
it's a little bit more than amateur, I'd
okay.
like
So
to think.
I'm the amateur in this conversation. Perfect. So I can learn something.
I
Uh,
just there's no like therapy version for political psychology, you know?
hmm.
But amateur in this, if you know, if part of being a professional is like being a professor or, you know, leading research studies, then yeah, maybe throw me in the amateur bin.
Fair enough. So I wonder how what do you learn in university when you do political sciences and then with this focus on psychology?
The cool thing about political science is it's really broad. So I imagine there's a lot of subjects like this. You know, math is like this. You can do abstract math, you can do, you know, geometry, you can do algebra, you can do calculus, you can do differential equations. Like there's so many different things you can do, and political science is very similar, where um, you know, you can focus, as I did, on American politics or comparative politics. I did both because I'm all about, well, I'm all about trying to make life better, and I live in America, so that's what I focused on. But I also focused on comparative politics because you can't know how things can be better without having something to compare it to. And then I always had this little like, what makes people what makes people go in the direction they want to go in. And so when I got to grad school, I studied things like democracy and autocracy, and the best course I took was political psychology. And it's something I really dove in head first into. And even within political psychology, I mean, I have a, I don't want to say a narrow focus, but I do have one thing within political psychology that I'm really interested in, which I've already talked about. But you could talk about like, I remember one of the things we discussed was like, if you send people a mailer with, you know, X framing, how does it affect them, right? That's not exactly what I talk about in my videos, but it's still relevant to political psychology.
Hmm.
And
I see.
so I was particularly interested in what makes people authoritarian because it's so different from my way of thinking. To have such a submissive to authority attitude, personality, viewpoint is just so antithetical to the way I think, and I think I'm fascinated by difference.
Hmm. So in that sense, we come from the same direction. So what I suggest we do is I wanted to ask you to establish a sort of model framework, and then we converge towards authoritarianism. And while we're going there, maybe I can give some inputs from my work, which is I wrote this paper to create a model named psychorealism, which is in international relations, you have this big school of thought, which is called realism. Professors like, well, intellectuals like John Mearsheimer is the most best-known proponent nowadays. Before that, the original was Hans Morgenthau. There's a whole theory, a whole history behind it. And it just suffers, for example, the gist of realism is that the world is anarchic because there is no world policeman, right? So states compete in an anarchical setting. Therefore, it serves them to maximize their own strengths because that maximizes their security, right? So you want to be the toughest, buffest guy in an anarchic setting, right? And therefore, he, in his great book, for example, the Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he says that these sort of wars and conflicts, as we're having now with the, the changing world order, China rising, the U.S.'s power in relative decline, and so on and so forth, are inevitable. And so what I did is this framework is fully blind to ideology, individuals, internal politics, domestic politics, and so it suffers some shortcomings. And what I did is I added a modulus that introduces a psychology into this, and there's a whole model. We can get into that, but I want to hear what you want to say about it. But before that, I wanted to jump into something you said before, which is comparative politics. And I've also written about the Ukraine crisis, right? And it turns out that nowadays it seems to be less the case, but in the early phases, in like 2022 and 2023, when you try to put the whole, invasion of Russia against Ukraine into context, people called you, ooh, this is whataboutism. But comparative politics is just that, placing things into context, isn't it?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, the way I see comparative politics, and maybe this is just biased by the things that I study within comparative politics, which is it's all internal stuff, right? So I took a course on British politics post World War II, right? And you go through the kind of political history and how wonderful Margaret Thatcher was. I think we could all agree she was awesome.
Awesome.
If anyone's just listening, I'm leaning into the camera, indicating that I'm being sarcastic. Um, but a lot of it is like voting systems, right? Like comparing stuff like that. So I don't have much of a background in international relations. I will say that up front. Though when I was reading your piece on this, I noticed Madeleine Albright from my alma mater, Columbia, someone we're very proud of.
Oh yeah.
Again, that was sarcasm.
Now you gotta be proud. I mean, she actually was one of the more well, the more honest ones, right? In an interview, I think I don't remember the date, but in a famous interview, she got asked, your policies against Iraq cost 500,000 children their lives because of the sanctions alone for about, I don't know how many years it was. And she proudly said, yes, this is a price we're willing to pay. So,
I've often thought about like how good is it for bad people to be just bluntly honest versus them having to weasel around and lie and because on one end, right, if they're just upfront, it does give other people permission to just be openly evil. And it, in a way, I almost feel like it normalizes it. Whereas if they're lying, it's like they know deep down that there's something they should be ashamed about, or they feel this pressure to not be genuine. But on the other hand, it also gives like the dumb grugs that follow them the talking point excuses and the BS, and the people that don't pay attention can be swayed by it. So I really wonder it because I forever, and maybe this is because I'm autistic, I've just been like, just be honest, just be, you're evil, just be honest. And very recently I've had the maybe it's better if they feel so ashamed that they do wind up lying. And I don't really know the answer as to which is better.
I have a hypothesis of that if you would indulge me.
Go for it, please.
So let me first sketch out the model for our listeners from where I come from, because the context is important for my judgment in the end, right? So the way I see this, we've been talking with friends, with personal friends of mine around here, and they say, stop fighting horizontally, that is among each other, and look upwards, which is a modern version of saying class warfare, right? Upwards is the problem. It's the 1%, top 0.1% or whatever. So don't look against, I don't know, migrants or gays or whatever it is. Look at those with the yachts, right? Those that fly private jets left and right just because they're running customs, right? And so, what does this mean? It sounds very leftist, etc. No, I actually want to be fair and scientific here. I am actually left. I'm going to say that up front. I am very, very much on the classical, canonical left. That is the social justice left, not the modern LGBTQ left and all that. I would call it perversions, although much of it is not actually a perversion. But I mean the original historically left. But
Do you
that's
mean
not
a
to,
more class-oriented left rather than
yes,
a using identity politics exclusively to pretend that you're actually against the powerful?
precisely.
But you're still like pro-trans rights, right? You're still
I have
pro like,
no problem with pro-trans or gay rights or anything like that.
all right,
No issues with that whatsoever. So
good.
the
All right.
the way I see this is you have, how should I put it? Many people are familiar with the big five personality types in psychology. It's like the standard model of psychology. It basically subdivides each human personality into five dimensions. For those that are curious, I think it was, I actually have it in front of me. Let me scroll down.
I got you. So you can use the acronym OCEAN.
Oh
So
yeah,
O for open-mindedness, C for conscientiousness, E for extroversion or introversion, A for agreeableness, and N for neuroticism. The problem with the N, of course, is that really the higher the number, the more emotionally stable you are. But it's really convenient to have an acronym.
awesome. Thank you very much. Yeah, I often forget one of those. I tend to confuse with one or two of them. But of course, there's several issues. You cannot divide a human into five dimensions, but it's good enough to be highly reproducible. It reproduces even across cultures, across history, and so on. So it's good enough to create a model within which we can sort of arrange personalities, right? Five dimensions gives a certain resolution. If I have two extremes, maximally agreeable versus maximally non-agreeable, stiff-mindedness, yeah, yeah, and then you have five of them. You have 2 to the 5 different personalities. I think that's 32.
If I may add, part of the reason why this is a better system than, for example, astrology is that astrology, beyond being unscientific, it's prescriptive. It says that you, because you were born on a certain day, you must have this personality type or
Mm,
these desires or these motivations. Whereas the Big Five is descriptive and it says, okay, this is a way of describing who you are
yeah,
in these categories.
that's good. That's good. Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you for the addition. And as a physicist, of course, this is for me somewhat still unsatisfactory because we want to not just be descriptive, we want to actually be have explanatory power. The big five don't say why you're agreeable, it just says that you're agreeable. But let's put that aside. So besides these big five personality traits, I mention them because they are relevant. There is also a two-dimensional model. Well, uh, it's a value type model. These are the personality types, and now we also have value types. And this, to my knowledge, is fairly recent research. I think the papers go back as little as 2014 or something like that. And it's from Jonathan Haidt, star psychologist, and his colleagues. And what they do is they basically take look at moral value types, and they find two distinguished ones. I presume in the future we're going to find more than two because it's so recent. So basically, our model is very, very, very gross. But for now, we have only two dimensions, and those are, and these are the scientific labels he used in this paper, not necessarily political terms, conservative and liberal. Now, how do they classify these people? They took morality, ethics, and subdivided that in turn into another system of five. So we have the big five personality and the big five, well, five dimensions of morality. And so what Jonathan Haidt and colleagues did, they divided morality into five, which is harm, fairness, in-group versus out-group loyalty, authority and respect, and purity. Now, harm is very clear. Do not harm others. Reciprocity is basically the golden rule as all cultures have found them, and Kant, the German philosopher, found them, and it's known in the Bible as the golden rule. Do unto others as you wish them to do upon you. Then you have loyalty. How important is loyalty to you? Authority, how important is your, I don't know, your local priest or father figure or whatever. And then purity, something like, shall I eat shrimp or pork for Muslims, and so on and so forth.
And being
Now,
weird about sex.
yeah, that too, of course. Sex is everywhere. And so that brings me then to my original hypothesis to answer you. Well, to that I mentioned before. And that is that conservative people have a whole different notion of what evil is than liberal people do. And
Yes.
I would surmise that conservative people, those are the Thatchers, for example, the Reagans, for example, and well, most of the US administration actually. And so what happens is that these people value, they're very hierarchical, they're very orderly, they differ from liberal people in many ways. For example, they conservative types score higher on conscientiousness, so they're better disciplined, they're better at networking, they're better at just politics in some sense. They are less creative. They put greater emphasis on authority. They put much less emphasis on fairness. For them, if someone does better, then they deserve more, and therefore social justice makes little less sense than actual Darwinism, for example. Yeah, go
Now,
ahead.
if you're interested in why, right? So why are conservatives less creative? If we go back to the big five factors of personality, conservatives are much less open-minded. And open-minded isn't just, conservative grandpa. He loves drinking Coors Light and he's not going to have the new craft beer that you brought. He's going to keep drinking Coors Light. It's not just that. It's also openness to different kinds of perspectives, different ways of thinking, different kinds of people, and as well as art. So if you're less open-minded, you're going to be less creative.
Mm, yeah.
I will say, in terms of the big five factor, the number one biggest difference is open-mindedness. There are studies that show conscientiousness to be different, as you noted, but there's also studies that show that there's no difference. There's been studies that show there's tiny, tiny differences in extroversion. Most studies show no difference. There's studies that show that there are tiny differences in agreeableness. Most studies show that there's no difference. It's that openness to experience that's the most important personality difference between people on the right and people on the left. But keep going, because when you say hierarchy, ooh, you're tickling the happy brain chemicals for me over here.
Yes. Well, no, actually, thank you very much for this addendum. I don't know if I've ever read that among the big five, openness is the biggest difference between the two value types. So just to put things back into nice and orderly things for people maybe following this acoustically, we have the personality types, which is a five-dimensional model, and now we're talking a bit further downstream about the value types model, and we just established that the biggest difference between these two value types in terms of the five personality types is along the, well, five dimensions of personality is along the openness. Okay, so, well, yeah, basically what I wanted to say is that liberals and conservative types, they differ in all sorts of ways. For example, yeah, we mentioned hierarchy, and one of the corollaries of that is that conservative types are much more prone to believe that might makes right. And so I would
Yes.
surmise when you said about, about the stuff you said before, the question you had before about, what happens in the minds of evil people, I would surmise that conservative-minded people will tend to see actual good in social disparities, because those that are the richest, they are the best, therefore they deserve the most resources because they allocate them best, and they're the most productive, right? We've heard all these myths about the free market from the free marketeers with the rising tide that lifts all boats, right?
Yes. While I agree with what you're saying, what you have to add is that conservatives often think some people are fundamentally better. It's not just like, oh, they're the more productive ones. Oh, they're the smarter ones. Oh, they create jobs. No, it's like a lot of conservatives just think some people are better, and that includes men over women, that includes racism, and that includes, Christians or whatever your religious affiliation is over other types of people. Native born versus migrant or immigrant. They just think that some people are fundamentally better.
Well, they are, aren't they?
Well, they certainly aren't correct. If there are, they certainly aren't correct about who. I don't think anyone's fundamentally better. I think that people can be better based on their values, but that means they're just more moral. There are some people that are better on intelligence, but that just means they're smarter. Um, There's some people that are more productive, but I know people that aren't productive in the capitalist sense that are a lot better people than those who are very productive in the capitalist sense. But what you're talking about, I mean, in terms of the moral foundations, um, you're very right. It's very much based on like my group better than your group, and there is a survival mechanism. If you think about when we were back in hunter-gatherer times, you had to be very cohesive within your tribe in order to survive because we're a communal species. This is part of the reason why libertarianism is total BS. That's actually probably more relevant for the American listeners because you guys don't seem to have as much toxic libertarianism over in Europe.
Oh,
Um,
believe me, we do, we do. There's a lot of it. Um, well,
is it
just
growing? Is it bad?
so, how should I put it? One of my best friends, I would actually consider myself libertarian, right? Because
In a
freedom.
left-wing sense, in like the way that libertarianism used to be, where it's like actually a left-leaning, like anti-authoritarian, or in the American hyper-capitalist.
Oh, no, no, no. In the
Um,
standard philosophy of enlightenment, European school of thought sense, in
okay,
the sense that individual freedom is important and it's valued. That said, of course, there's the American libertarian, which is a whole
yeah,
like a whole subspecies. But let us stick to the
yes. Well,
let it,
they're an interesting group. They're an interesting group psychologically because, in a way, they're very authoritarian. It's just that they don't necessarily believe in white supremacy. I mean, a lot of them do. They don't necessarily believe in male supremacy, though some of them do. It's more that they believe in the supremacy of the business owner and that the business owner should be imbued with an immense amount of power, dictatorial power, which is what capitalism fundamentally is. Capitalism is fundamentally an authoritarian relationship between owners and workers. But libertarians believe that it shouldn't be the government that has authoritarian power, but these god king capitalists. So in a
yeah.
way, they are very authoritarian.
So wait, let me structure this a little bit. I want to get into the evolutionary in the evolutionary branch that you mentioned before.
I'm happy
I
to do
want
that. Yeah.
I want to mention the values and morality also. But where was I with my thought before. Just to just structure and streamline things,
Sure,
right?
you were talking about how hierarchy. So, like people on the left, right? People on the left think more in terms of care and fairness, and harm reduction,
Yes.
whereas
So
people on
yeah,
the right think more in terms of authority, loyalty, sanctity, purity.
yes. I got my train of thought back. Thank you. So what I wanted to say is that I think so what I was saying is I'm a libertarian myself. I think personal individual freedom is important, but it is not the goal. It is part of the whole package of well-being, right? This is the first thing. Whereas we're libertarians, I think often most of those that I encounter, at least their writings, and I'm actually reading Ludwig von Mises right now, and I've read Douglas Murray and others on the right because I just need to understand them, right? Just some academic, um, scholarly curiosity. And what I found is that these people tend to oftentimes put freedom as a goal in itself to be striven for, and they have a very basic toy model of freedom. And I've talked with a friend of mine who is a libertarian, and I tell him, look, man, freedom is not just there. Freedom costs resources. The very act, the very, you know, for you to have the freedom to fly to Mexico tomorrow, all this infrastructure, all the science, all the great minds that came before us that dealt with aerodynamics, with thermodynamics, all that needs to be here. You need to have the wealth, you need to be born in the right century, and you need to know of the technology that exists there and how to buy the ticket and all that. It's not just their freedom. You have to study for it. You need to learn that it is there, how to make use of it, and you require the resources. And so if you want to maximize freedom, you want to maximize also resources that are spread across everyone. You don't want to focus resources on a couple multi billionaires and so on. But anyway, that's
Can
different
I
topic.
add?
Just go ahead.
So, one of the differences between the way that the right and left view freedom is that the right sees it. I'm just going to be straight up. They see it a lot more selfishly. They see it a lot more in terms of um, nobody's telling me what to do. You're not going to tell me what to do, mom. It's kind of how I see it. Where it's this is called negative liberties, where there's nothing impeding you, and there are also things like positive liberties. So if, for example, you're in what I call a grown-up country, you have universal health care. That is a positive liberty, a positive freedom. Where in America, if you get sick, you could be straddled with debt, you could go bankrupt, you can just die because you didn't get through the wallet biopsy, right? So people on the left think of freedom in terms of both negative and positive liberties because you are not free if you are dying in poverty. You are not free if you do not have access to healthcare. You are not free if you do not have a retirement. You are not free if you cannot pay for a roof over your head, if there are not good jobs. And you are not free if you do not have a clean environment. And unfortunately, libertarians, particularly right-wing ones, um, think only in terms of how they are not impeded.
Mhm. Yeah, I know what you mean. I actually read the whole Stanford public course on philosophy where they talked about positive and negative freedoms. I do see that it makes sense to distinguish those two, but in the end, it still costs resources. So if you go back one abstraction layer further, I think there is not a clean distinction between positive and negative. But be that as it may, let us,
I like that. Thumbs up.
yeah, thank you. Let us go to the historic because I think this is important before we move on maybe to the ethics and then finally to the politics side of things. Well, we have talked a lot about politics, but then more about authoritarianism and your works. So what I've come to across my research and literature is that these two value types, right, the liberal and the conservative value types, they are the products of evolution, as I would surmise virtually every culture and well, so some of ideas and body of ideas is, right? So certain ideas propagate better than others. There's a term coined by Richard Dawkins in one of his books. I forgot which one it was. I referenced it somewhere. And it's about a meme. A meme is the basic self-replicating unit equivalent to the gene. The gene is the digital information itself replicates. And so a meme could be, for example, a joke. A joke self-replicates by virtue of its being told and retold, and then it evolves as a function of the environment, just evolution, right? And so what happened is there's a huge book by Robert Textor. I did not read the whole thing, just excerpts of it. And it turns out that these value types appear to have evolved in different settings. You have settings with lush, large biodiversity, figure a jungle or some tropical environment. And then you have contrast that with desert type, very hard to live environments. And it turns out that in the desert type environments, the conservative mindsets seem to have provided you a survival benefit. For example, all these cultures of honor are very much conservative, right? If you kill one of mine, I'm going to kill 10 of yours. And then it makes sense to raid other pastures. So it makes sense to become pastoralist in these environments, right? To have a herd of sheep or something. Whereas in the lush environment, you don't need to actually have a herd. You can just go from one part of the jungle to the next, and you will always find food. You will always find animals here and there, and you're more nomadic rather than the desert types, which are more sedentary. And so it turns out that these different value types have evolved in these different environments. So you have the conservatives that are more in arid environments, very hard environments. And then you have the liberals that are more in lush environments, that are more nomadic, more matriarchal rather than patriarchal, and all the other stuff we said about those value types. What do you think of that?
Yes, so this is a bit evolutionary psychology, which I am limited in, but we also have to remember there are factors such as sometimes an idea spreads just because it spreads. Like it
Yep.
just happens to have spread in the area that it was in. You know, a lot of the things in the Christ myth are just stories that happened in the Eastern Mediterranean. They kind of got aggregated. The idea of a dying and rising God that takes on disciples, performs miracles, blah blah blah. This is just an idea that's just kind of spread. Um, Now, when you say that, you have to be very specific about what you mean by survival, because from a species-wide perspective, conservatism, the idea that we need to raid other villages for our resources, these are actually bad for the overall species from like a very, like an alien perspective, right? But from an individual perspective, can be better, sure. The idea of property rights, don't steal my turnips. You can see why these would evolve, but um, what we see here is how, unfortunately, because there are other conservatives, you need to be conservative in order to protect yourself. But if there were no other people that were like, I'm going to steal their crap because they're part of the different group, so I can just steal their stuff and be fine, like, kind of creates like a vicious circle at the bottom, you know what I mean? And also, you have to factor in population density. Population density is something that that massively affects civilizations. So
Hmm.
if you live in a low density environment, you don't need property rights because you just go over there. There's no people over there. You just go over there, they get the food, take it, you know? This is one of the big reasons why sub-Saharan Africa outside of the Sahel region, so Mali, modern day Mali and Ghana, for example, which were more population dense, but a lot of, you know, people in the Congo and further south, they lived more nomadic lives because the population density of sub-Saharan Africa is, I think, just about the lowest in the world outside of Antarctica. Don't be correcting us, okay? Um, and the same goes for what is today Brazil. You know, thousands of years ago, very low population density. Whereas when you have a higher population density, the need for property rights, the need for like this is my plot of land, don't steal my carrots, becomes much more relevant, and that's where you get more states, hierarchy,
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. And then of course that leaks into the culture.
Yeah. So I love that you mentioned alien perspective. I wrote that actually down because I don't know what. Actually, I'm going to ask you this afterwards. I'm just going to give you where how I interpret this. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with Noam Chomsky,
I am
and
familiar, yes.
yes, and one of the things
Some
he
sad
tends.
news about him recently.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's another Pandora's box. Um, so he tends to speak of geopolitics. Usually, I mean, he's actually a linguist, but he's done a lot of work on geopolitics and domestic politics. And what he tends to say is he tends to imagine the world as it was seen by aliens, which means an impartial outside view there, which is not part of humanity. And it seems at times just so unbelievably irrational. And this is also a perspective which allows Chomsky to portray, look, man, if you actually view this objectively, that is at least impartially, like you're not in the camp of those guys or in the camp of those guys, of the, I don't know, leftists or rightists or pro-war or anti-war or whatever it may be, then actually this one side is really in the wrong, right?
Yeah.
Because you have to actually sometimes look inwards if you're looking for the problem, not just outwards. And so, yeah, I mean, did you come up with alien perspectives yourself? Was it inspired by something? I forgot to ask in the beginning about that.
Yeah, so that was my old channel name. That you go back a long time ago. That was my original like YouTube channel name. My I've wanted to do media for my entire adult life, and I called it Alien Perspective because I didn't just want to call it by my name. And I was doing like weekly news, and I burned out. I was not very good at it. I didn't feel like I was adding to the conversation. And so I took some time off, and that's how I started doing political psychologies because I really wanted to add something to the conversation. I didn't just want to be some, another white guy, progressive, talking about the news. There's so many of those. Be different somehow, right? And the name Alien Perspective, funny enough, it has three motivations, and Chomsky is a distant third.
Hmm.
Took me actually a while to go through my Chomsky phase. And the first reason is because back in high school, I used to talk about, like, dude, imagine if aliens looked at America and blah, 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 social injustice, right? The main example was like healthcare. I don't know if you guys have heard, but America's healthcare system, it's not great. So it's just the absurdity and the irrationality and the injustice and the cruelty of we are the richest country ever and we don't make sure that everyone has healthcare. Like, that's so crazy to me. And so I used to say, imagine if aliens looked at us for the same reason apparently the Chomsky did. And so that was just kind of like I don't want to say it was kind of a shtick I had when I talked about politics. The second reason is because I'm autistic, and I am not unique in the experience of feeling as an autistic person like I'm an alien, because one thing about us is we don't absorb cultural assumptions as much, right? We didn't get that software update when we were a kid.
Mhm.
And you just feel different when you relate to people and when you communicate to people, and the assumptions you have are just so different or non-existent. And it makes you feel like an alien, really makes you feel like an outsider. And that's probably why I have so many friends that are from other countries, because in a way they have an alien perspective too, at least on the culture and politics of the United States. And then I also understood that Chomsky talked about this too. So it's like, oh, that's a cool tie-in.
That's amazing. Yeah, I love it. Love it. So I suggest we move from the sociology. Now we can sort of move more into the political. And I think you cannot have politics if you don't have values. So we did talk a little bit about the values. I also wrote about it in my piece here. And this sort of goes back to the whole morality thing. So I, let me complement what you said earlier about from
Oh,
what,
I'm all
what
for compliments. Give them to me.
go ahead. Of course. You mentioned before, what did you mention? Something about, yeah, exactly. You need to be conservative because you have other conservative people near you, right? If that guy wants to steal your plot and he's like super loyal only to his own in-group, then you need to be super protective of your in-group. Otherwise, you lose the whole evolutionary battle. And I think there's a lot to that. Because if you do run this whole thing mathematically, right? We have a concept called game theory. It's fairly well known. Most people know it under the toy models like the prisoner's dilemma. Two guys are caught. Let's call them, I don't know, Jacques and Claude. They're caught during some crime. And then they're each offered a deal, right? If you rat on the other, you get very little sentence, but the other guy gets maximum sentence. If neither rats on the other, they both get a fairly mild sentence. And if both rat on each other, then they both just rot forever, right? If you do this experiment once, the rational thing is to just rat on the other, because you have to assume that he'll rat on you, and then there is a chance that you might get free card. Because if you don't rat on the other, hoping that he doesn't rat on you, hoping for the mild overall best sentence because it reduces the overall prison time the most, then you're running a huge risk. And so people will say, yes, game theory says that you have to be selfish and so on. That is not quite true, because if you go into more modern variants of game theory, where you have repeated experiments, where you have potential intercommunication between these two, or preparation, and you repeat the experiment again and again, and we do encounter each other again and again in daily life, right? Then it turns out that cooperative strategies actually evolve, well, show themselves to be better at survival in evolutionary sense in the game theory. So yes, actually, mathematically, the whole, conservative mindset, the whole I'm gonna do the best for me and then everyone else can take care of themselves, the whole my people first prerogative, that is actually a pretty harmful way of living. So I would say from that stance, you can actually say mathematically it's less moral to be in a conservative mindset than the liberal mindset.
Oh yeah. I don't think that's particularly controversial, to be honest. I mean, just look at the countries that have the highest standards of living. They're all the most progressive. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Switzerland, Australia. These are all the countries that are the most progressive, particularly economically. If you look at the developed countries that are the most conservative, they're typically the ones with the worst inequality, the worst social inequality, not just economic, but America very conservative. We have horrible racism. We have horrible amounts of sexism. We're just totally friggin' backwards on LGBT people. At least a third of the country is, and we have a lower standard of living. A lot of places in America are third world country level, and we're the richest country in the world, right? So like, congratulations, we have the most billionaires, and also I mean, dude, some of these towns, they're like not far away from like medieval village level standard of living. It's like I'm serious. Like people get this like idea of I hope the world is starting to wake up to how terrible it is here in America in a lot of places. It's not great. So just in but see, here's what we're doing, right? We're going right in terms of care and harm. Now, I think care, harm, and fairness are the best moral foundations. I think they're a lot better than like blindly following your in-group and being loyal to them no matter what they do. I think they're certainly more moral than might makes right, authority's good. But we're proving the point that Jonathan Haidt talks about, which is we're on the left and we're talking about care and harm.
Mhm. Well, um,
I mean, haven't you considered that America's conservative system, it's just better for billionaires and authority, bro. They're just better.
oh yeah, no, we're getting right into the politics. I just want to add on to complement something that you said, which is um, if you take those five values, the five dimensions of morality, which Haidt and colleagues use for their separation between conservative and liberal mindsets, right? So you have the two values that are the ones liberals focus most, which is harm, do not harm others, and what was the second? Reciprocity, right?
Fairness.
Fairness, exactly. Okay, and then conservatives tends to build on all five more or less equally. That is, to conservatives, loyalty is virtually as important as harm or fairness. So is purity, what kind of foods or sex or whatever you can have. And so is authority, right? Just follow my priest, my Quran, my Bible, my whatever, right? Now, if you look at this again from a rather more abstract perspective, which I tend to do as a physicist, I think it's because I'm a physicist, maybe it's just my mind, I'm not sure. Be that as it may, what happens then is that you realize that the root of all conflict is precisely from these three conservative values, right? Because the second you impose rules of purity, it's whose purity? Is it pork or shrimp? The second you impose authority, we have to follow him because he is the anointed one, he has read the Quran or whatever. Well, it's my authority versus your authority. And the second you have loyalty, you automatically have to have an in-group which is excluded from, well, the out-group which is excluded and the in-group that is included. So the only way to have really animosity is to have this distinction between in and out-group. Whereas if you take harm, do not harm yourself, do not harm others. Reciprocity by definition is, is something intersubjective between all of us. And so the liberal value types are actually universalizable. They are universal, in fact.
Yes.
That is why all cultures came up with the golden rule, because it's so universal, it's so blatantly obvious that in order to have harmonious living with each other, we have to have harmonious universal values, right?
Yep, and you name me a war, and it is started by right wingers trying to kill the right wingers of of another group, almost always.
Yeah, no, it's true. Just to take devil's advocate, I believe that a well, canonical right winger would say, yeah, but what about communism? It killed so and so many million people, and I
I
think
would
it's
love to talk about that. Yes, here is my response to that. Okay,
all right. Let's
so
go into it.
first off, um, the idea that like all workers should have rights has killed nobody as far as I'm concerned. I'm not familiar with this leading to mass death. The reason the communism has killed tens of millions of people. That's primarily because of the Great Famine of the early 60s in China, where they failed in their Great Leap Forward. And that's because of terrible right-wing policy, as it turns out. Just because politicians give themselves a label doesn't mean they actually fit it. It's amazing to me how motivated people are on all sides, but particularly on the right, where they will believe politicians when it's convenient and then they'll disbelieve politicians when it's convenient rather than when it's just factually correct, right? So it's amazing how like politicians lie. Politicians lie. They lie all the time. All the time. One of the easiest lies they have is what their label is, because it's some amorphous thing that most people don't look into. Was the Soviet Empire actually socialist? Well, socialism is when workers democratically operate and collectively own their workplace. Did they have that in the Soviet Empire? No, they simply replaced the capitalist business owner with a government bureaucrat. The hierarchical authoritarian relationship between owner and worker was fundamentally the same. They were right wing. They
It's
had
so funny because
almost no
like
civil liberties. I mean, dude, you know what's amazing? America. America was closer to socialism during the existence of the Soviet Empire than the Soviet Empire ever got. Is modern day China really a socialist or communist country? No, they're extremely capitalist. They have billionaires. Like, just because they call themselves communist doesn't mean they are. And just because and if you'd like to take the stance that language changes, which I do agree with, then you want to say that there's three distinct types of socialism.
mhm.
So there's the kind of like progressive Keynesian economics, New Deal, post-war, universal health care, make sure that we have union protections and we have full employment, kind of
Education.
this kind of progressive socialism, right? You have communism, which is the right-wing authoritarian version of socialism, and then you have the classic socialism where workers democratically operate and collectively own the means of production, a kind of anarcho-syndicalist kind of economic system. Okay, communism's still right-wing, like like the right wing is the problem here, folks. It's the hierarchy. It's the certain people should be on top and should decide, and the other people are to serve. This relationship is key in right-wing politics, and it existed. It defines Soviet politics. They just weren't on the left. And one of the things that pisses me off is when people who identify as socialists like will defend these systems simply because they have the same label. And it's like we're falling into right-wing forms of thinking. In fact, from a psychological perspective, um, communists in the right-wing sense, people who defend the Soviet Empire, modern day China, so on, North Korea, oh God. These people, psychologically speaking, are basically indistinguishable from fascists.
Well, just for clarity, when you say right wing, because you seem to
Yes.
say right wing and immediately connected to the hierarchy,
Yes.
could you just for clarity define what you mean by right wing? Is it just that hierarchical? Is it
Yeah.
the value types we defined before? Is it this importance on hierarchy?
Yes. When you get right down to it, I think that in-group loyalty is a form of hierarchy because it says that my in-group is superior to out-groups. And I think that purity has an inherent hierarchical uh, component in that it says my purity, my definition of purity, this is what you were talking about earlier. My definition of purity should be imposed on other people. And it's very selfish because it's an emotional reaction, right? It's a disgust reaction.
Mhm.
It's people that are that like either gay people are ooky or they're actually turned on, they're actually gay themselves and then they think themselves are ooky, right? And then they project that, right? So there's a very selfish component to this kind of purity politics. But yes, fundamentally, when you get right down to it, as much as I want to like the political compass, which if you're familiar, if you're not familiar, it's the two-dimensional. So
Yeah.
you've got left and right economics, and you've got the up and down hierarchy. This is an appreciated level of nuance, but an unnecessary level of nuance. Politics is linear. I'm sorry, politics is linear, and it's all about power. When you get right down to politics, comes down to power. Who has power? How much power? Whom do they have power over? Okay. White supremacy is about power. Capitalism is about power. Feudalism was about power. It is fundamentally, if you break down every single political debate, monarchy versus democracy, anything, it comes down to on one extreme is concentrated power, and on the other extreme is equality of power, is egalitarianism. Every single issue comes down to that. And every single issue, people on the right are for more concentrated power, and people on the left are for more egalitarian distribution of power. So, through this lens, which I think is just the correct lens, the idea that, like, the left is about more government in the economy, like, this is really stupid. This is a very stupid right-wing corporate, from the wealthy perspective
It's a
on
straw man.
on economics, because the government could intervene and give oil corporations billions of dollars. Or the government could intervene and regulate these oil corporations so they're not dumping toxicity into the drinking water of, let's get real, mostly marginalized communities. These are government interventions. They have very different outcomes. They have fundamentally different outcomes. If you have Stalin on one end of your political spectrum and Hitler on the other, when they fundamentally were very, very similar, you have a broken and incomprehensible spectrum.
Yeah, no, fair. Just um, to push back a little, play devil's advocate, I would say people on the right oftentimes advocate for free markets. That's more like economically right because you can be socially left and right, and then economically left and right, right? And I would say that people often advocate for free markets. Why? Because the modern day rationalization that they've given them, because back in the day was the invisible hand, the one line in the secondary work of Adam Smith, right? By the way, Adam Smith writings are great. I would say he is more of a socialist than people realize. Be
Oh,
that as
dude,
it
for
may.
real.
Yeah.
People don't realize how anti-monopoly he was.
Yeah, he was. Actually, the whole class struggle idea came originally from him. So Marx and Engels, in a way, actually just copy pasted it. But be that as it may, what I wanted to say is that free marketeer people, people who support, I don't know, Thatcherite or Reaganite policies, will say we need the free markets because what is this? It's nothing more than the wisdom of the crowd, right? Because everyone gets to vote to decide, and that's the best way we can move forward with pricing and ideas. So I would say, in a way,
Yes.
they do recognize the value of equal voices and participation, the whole democratic idea and the flat hierarchies. But then when it comes to deciding within the company, what socialism actually is, as you said, the workers have a right to decide what happens with the productivity that they actually provide.
And vote on their bosses. Yeah.
Yeah, and vote. Yeah, then they push back, and I think this is a structural thing, and I would say that yeah, just I wanted to push back on that side because I do think that these
Yes.
people that, on one hand side, yes, they love hierarchy. They're very hierarchically driven, just fundamentally, as we talked about with the value and personality types. And on the other side, they tend to realize the value of everyone participating in a flat hierarchy because if they will say that why does communism, socialism, or whatever terms they want to throw around not work? Because no group of experts can be as smart as the whole market and everyone participating.
Sure. I would love to respond to this. So
Go ahead.
first off, the idea that being free market is right wing is very contextual. In Russia in 1990, if you were a free marketer, you were a liberal, you were on the left, you were for radically changing the system. If you lived in 1700 or 1750 or more recently, depending on where you lived, believing in a free market capitalist system was very progressive, especially compared to feudalism. I mean, my God. Um, and here's where I fundamentally disagree. Is just because they say they believe in something doesn't mean they actually believe in something. Most people have their emotions come first and their politics come second, and a lot of what they say, a lot of their talking points are justifications and excuses for what they actually feel, right? So does the homophobe have a principled stance that the Bible is against uh, gay rights, or do they just not like gay sex? It kind of freaks them out. We know what the answer is. Because if they had a principled stance that the Bible should be true, they would believe in debt forgiveness. They would believe that you shouldn't have clothing that's like a wool polyester blend. That would be illegal. You wouldn't be able to eat certain foods on certain days. I mean, I've never seen in America, there's anti-abortion rallies. You ever seen an anti-bacon rally? Bible's against bacon. You can't eat pork. Where's my anti-bacon rally? It's because they just don't like women, right? And so when it comes to like these free market arguments, I think it's an appeal to like freedom, because if you're for freedom, you're better.
Yeah.
And if you put the word free, you're just morally superior. But do the actions actually back that up? No. In the United States, Reagan was the one that stopped enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, which allowed for monopolies to form. That's
Mhm.
why we have four airlines. That's why we have five corporations that own basically all of our media. This is the result of right-wing policy. So the if you look at the results, they don't actually bring about a free market. In order to maintain a free market, according to Adam Smith, you need anti-monopoly protections. You need a currency.
Y-
Governments create the currency. Like, there
y-
is no such thing as a free market. And what they fundamentally believe is that business owners are just better. They just think they're superior, that business owners should decide. And there's obviously, in a lot of places, a racist and sexist element to that, because who do they think of owning these businesses? It's white men.
Now we can maybe do another episode where we just analyze the whole interface between imperialism and capitalism and the ideology from the a third axis coming in the psychology, because I do think there's a lot there to unpack, and I'm not sure myself, but to me there's a clear correlation between imperialism, racism, supremacism, and
Oh
the
yeah.
capitalist ideology. But I think that's a whole. I think that would just explode the whole thing. So let
No,
me.
come on, we could talk about it. Why not? Because here's the thing. Here's one thing I disagree with leftists on, is the idea that capitalism and imperialism, like, they not only go hand in hand, but like with no capitalism, you wouldn't have imperialism. It's like, dude, during feudal times, like there was horrible imperialism. Like it just wasn't global because of technology, right? The Roman Empire was imperialism. They weren't capitalist. But there is, because of resource extraction, and my group is better than your group, and I can exploit your group, and that's okay, because I'm on top and you ain't. Might makes right. Um, that
No,
that
hold
that
up.
that's my 2 cents.
I'm sorry for interrupting. I do think this is really interesting. I actually would like to pursue this in a separate episode if you don't mind. Um, I,
Okay.
I would like to to keep the structure and to move the whole thing to from the general discussions we had about politics, about left and right, and well, the contextualization as you provided about free markets being left or right, right, because depending on where and when. And I was really interested in hearing from you where you come from with the whole idea of authoritarianism, both on the
Yes.
subject side, as we have probably some inclinations already because the subjects say, yeah, this guy is better, so we should follow him, and on the guy who actually sits on the throne, right? So where do you, yeah, tell us how do you see the whole thing? What is authoritarianism for you? Where does it come from, and why does it thrive in a society supposedly that has overthrown kings and had the French and U.S. revolutions, right?
You're not talking about America, are you? We're not authoritarian. What are you talking about? This
USA.
current administration is super pro freedom, bro. Haven't you heard them say that they're for free speech in the midst of them deporting people for being pro Palestine? Um, yeah. Oh God. Well, this is a very broad I mean, are you interested in my thoughts on how America is sinking into fascism? Or, I mean, I could talk about the differences between the people on top, the Trumps, the Putins, the Netanyahus, who are called social dominators, versus the people that are the authoritarian followers. Like, what kind of specific thing would you be interested in? What
All right.
makes people authoritarian? What
Yeah,
makes a system authoritarian? What
let,
happens when an authoritarian system fails? Like, there's a lot of different things.
let's narrow this down. Let us start first by understanding each other. So would you define from your perspective, authoritarianism and fascism?
Yes,
These,
so
these two terms.
fascism is a subset of authoritarianism. Authoritarianism fundamentally, explain it as if a third grader can understand. Authoritarianism is when the person on top decides, period. They decide. They don't care about your input. I mean, maybe they care a little bit about your input, but fundamentally, they're the one that makes the decision. So you can see this in capitalism, right, between worker and owner. You can see this in Russia, where the votes aren't really counted properly, or in China, where they'd say, "You're not approved. You don't get to run." And you could see it in Saudi Arabia, where they just straight up have a king, and you could see it in pre-1789 France as well. Um, Fascism is a particular brand of authoritarianism because authoritarianism can be monarchy, authoritarianism can be communist, authoritarianism can be a military dictatorship, it could be a cult of personality, and authoritarianism can also be in the household. Parents can have an authoritarian relationship with their children, and not just in a like, the buck stops here. Like, obviously the parents can have better judgment than a 3-year old, so the parent decides. I mean, like like, how do I put this? The child really doesn't have any input, right? It's the because I said so, and that's always the answer, right? There's no explanation for why. There's no questioning the
Perhaps between
parent.
spouses within the same household is a
Yes, that's another form of authoritarianism that's very common, well, all too common, is, the man decides. You'll notice a lot of these are more traditional. Hmm, more conservative. So fascism, what makes fascism different? So it is a corporations and government power fuse. So you see this with uh, money in politics. You'll see this with cutting taxes on the wealthy. You'll see this with government subsidies. You'll see this with not regulating them. You'll see this with Elon Musk literally just cutting government aid and killing hundreds of thousands of people. Um, he is an indirect mass murderer, that Elon Musk. And fascism is also the corporate and state power. That's really the key right there. There's also a brand of anti-intellectualism. So some authoritarian regimes will not be anti-intellectual. I don't think China's authoritarian regime is particularly anti-intellectual, for example, because fascism is deliberately anti-empiricist. In other words, they don't care about evidence; they care about what they feel, and if they feel something strongly enough, they'll just it's real. Um, Fascism is also anti women. I'm sorry. They believe in traditional gender roles. They basically think that women should be like brood mares for the state. They're absolutely horrible towards women. Fascism is also horribly anti-gay and anti-trans. Any sort of like sexual deviation is very scary. Very much are scared of chaos and anarchy, and they're very fearful of a dangerous world on a psychological level. Fascism is also action for the sake of action, right? And you got to sacrifice yourself for the state. The state comes above all else. The state comes above your individual rights and liberties, which you probably have none of in fascism, especially if you're part of a marginalized group. Um, and Fascism is also super nationalist, if you can imagine.
all right. That's a lot of things. So the first part I was the definition I was aware of, which is when the state and corporations fuse.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, we can actually see a lot of that in the US, but we have been seeing this for a while. For example, Mark Milley, who was the general chief of staff, he was the one, by the way, who came up with the whole narrative that, Russia wanted to take Kiev in 3 days. No Russian general or official ever said that. Where is he now? I believe he's on the board of directors of Lockheed Martin or Raytheon. And then you have people from Lockheed just sat in last week's congressional hearing, you know, because we want to buy I think it would be good if the U.S. military buys 120 B-21 bombers. Actually, I think 200 are not bad. But what would you say, Congressman, or something like that? I'm almost verbatim citing them. And then the general, the military representative says, "Yes, I would love to have 200." And I bet you, in about, I don't know, 5 years, or when he's done with his service, he'll be in some cushy corner office in Raytheon, getting all your taxpayer money, actually our taxpayer money. Yeah, but yeah.
And you see that this inherent corruption. If I may distill fascism down, it is every hierarchy imaginable in modern technologically developed society. It is racial hierarchy. It is business owner supremacy. It is native born versus immigrant hierarchy. It's gender hierarchy, sexual hierarchy, religious hierarchy. It's literally, our country is superior to other countries. It is literally every form of hierarchy in one.
Mhm.
And that is why it is the most right wing you can possibly get.
So let us then finish off with how would you psychologically describe this drive towards authoritarianism? And let me just preface something with maybe something that will give you a path to a branch to pull, which is I haven't published it, but I have written on the structural advantages of the whole conservative right wing, well, let's call it ideology, set of ideas. And first of all, you're not conservative if the system does not serve you, and therefore you want to conserve it. So conservatives tend to already profit from the system structurally. Secondly, as I mentioned before, there's difference between liberal and conservative types, and the conservatives tend to be more conscientious. They are actually harder workers. We have to give credit where credit is due. And they are better at networking. So they have that too, which is also insanely important for political power. Furthermore, it is much easier to point to the past than to point to the future. That is why there's so much medieval sci-fi series and so few futuristic ones. And the futuristic ones usually get them wrong. Compare Star Trek 1950s to today's technology, right? It's very hard to predict what the future will be like, but it's much easier to look back.
And this comes back to lack of open-mindedness and lack of creativity, by the way.
Yeah, that too, precisely. And another structural advantage is, so they are the levers of power. They have all the advantages. And furthermore, it is intellectually much simpler because of, we know the past, we don't know the future. It's intellectually much simpler, much on a lower requirements level to get everyone aboard to say, classical gender roles, for example.
Yep.
Whereas to propose something new, be it an economic reform, a social reform, a new law for equal redistribution, right? Because I bet you when you go back to, I don't know, say the French Revolution, which we mentioned before, they would give the exact same arguments as nowadays economic rightists will say, no, we can't have healthcare because who would pay for that? How could we do this? As they said before, no, you can't have, everyone voting because the king just knows better. How would we do this, right? And the same again and again. And finally, what I wanted to say on that topic is that every single last item that conservatives today want to preserve, I don't know, say women's rights, but they don't want to give gay rights, whatever. Every single one of these items that conservatives today want to preserve had to be fought against the conservatives in the day when they were introduced.
Yes.
Right? So conservatism once again shows itself to not be a universalizable ethics to live by.
I
So
really wish that our schools and our media would teach that conservatives have always been on the wrong side of history. Always. Always. It's really easy to America because the biggest issue we've ever had is over slavery, and conservatives were the pro-slavery people.
that is a better example than the French Revolution. They would say, how can we afford, the whole South was living off of the
Yep.
cotton trade. And they would say, no, we can't afford just letting go of slavery, just as they would say today, no, we can't afford healthcare. Sorry for an interruption.
No, you're all good. So there's two little caveats I want to give. So first off, you say conservatives are harder working. Um, Perhaps in a capitalist sense. I mean, perhaps in a capitalist sense that's true. But if we look at work more broadly, I guarantee you, the more progressive you are, the more emotional labor you're doing. If you have a friend group that is mixed in political ideology, which is becoming less and less the case over time. The conservatives rely much more on the liberal members of the group for emotional labor than they do on the other conservative members of the group. It's just that that work just doesn't get paid. Um, and The other thing, what did I have to do? Oh man, you were talking about
Yeah.
simple-mindedness. You're talking about mental laziness. This is so key. One of the biggest appeals conservatism has is that it's easy to understand. Hierarchy is something that you understand beginning at the age of 2.
Mm.
It is a very simple cognitive process, whereas egalitarianism literally takes more mental effort to understand and to work out. So, um, this is why people on the right test for being more mentally lazy. And in fact, if you go back to the 5 moral foundations, the conservative moral foundations require less mental effort. And in fact, the prefrontal cortex, which is the most advanced thinking structure in the brain, people who have more conservative moral foundations, authority, in group loyalty, sanctity, and purity, they have less active prefrontal cortex, whereas people who think more in terms of harm reduction and care, as well as fairness and proportionality, have more active prefrontal cortex.
But this makes,
So
may I just interject?
go for it.
This makes perfect sense because if you follow authority, the rules are already there. You don't have to think for yourself. If you
They're already
follow the
thinking for
rules,
you.
yeah, if you follow the rules for purity, don't eat shrimp, don't eat pork, whatever, you don't have to evaluate this action for its actual harm in terms of hygiene for your body or not. You have to actually don't do this. It's very deontological, right? This is also why they tend to ask what would Jesus do because they go by following example. The famous psychologist at the turn of the century, Jean Piaget in Switzerland, by the way, he said that children emulate by following. If you take a group of children, they play, take one of them apart, ask them, can you describe the rules? No idea. But by following the example, he gets to see how it works and he just intuitively does it. And this is also a disadvantage we have on the left because we can't just show by example. We actually have to lay out the whole thing in an abstract sense. Again, cognitively very demanding, very much requiring imagination and openness. And then prove that this path is better, this progressive path is better than what we had until now. Sorry, I just wanted to interject that because it makes
No, it's all good, man.
good sense.
Um, hey, it's your podcast. You get to interrupt. All right, you have the authority to interrupt, and because you're the person that owns the podcast, your might makes right. Okay, you can use your words in you can imperialistically use your words over me.
Nah,
Um,
man, you're the guest, you're the king.
so you want to talk about where does authoritarianism come from? So there's this idea that, well, let's define authoritarianism in psychological terms, right? So Bob Altmaier, if you want to read more, Bob Altmaier, he's the one to go with. He was the leading researcher on the authoritarian personality during his time on Earth, and he defined it in 3 ways. So there's authoritarian submission, being submissive to authority. I think it's pretty obvious, but it's not just submission in terms of your actions, but it's what we're talking about. It's mental submission. It's not thinking for yourself. It's not questioning why things are the way that they are. Should things be differently? It's a very simplistic way of thinking. It's very gut feeling based, right? It's not very intuitive. It's very intuitive. It's not very analytical. This is one of the thinking differences in terms of style between right and left. People on the right rely more on their gut feelings. People on the left rely more on analytical thinking. So, the second dimension is authoritarian aggression. It's aggression against enemies or perceived enemies of the authority. So, in the United States, right now, the outgroup du jour is immigrants and trans people. And then the third dimension is sometimes called traditionalism, which I think is pretty obvious, like just believing in the thing that we all believe in because what is familiar feels comfortable, and what's comfortable feels safe. Whether it actually is or not, not necessarily.
Another structural advantage, yeah.
Yes, another structural advantage. What is comfortable or what is familiar is it feels safe. Um, but it's better called conventionalism because it's like we have these conventions that we will impose on you. Gay sex feels uncomfortable. We don't like that. You have to follow our convention, you know? But oh man, by the way, I wanted to add this. So you talked about how conservatives are typically the people that benefit like materially, financially, right? So that's why rich people are more so conservative, but it's also they benefit on an ego level, right? Poor men are often conservative because poor men benefit on an ego level by being told that patriarchy puts them on top. So I just wanted to add that white supremacy works very similarly. There's a lot of dumb, poor white people that are conservative because, hey, at least they're above the black man. Helps
Mhm.
their ego. So back to authoritarianism. What is this? Did you want to interject?
I just wanted to add on that because I had recently Jock McLaren on the podcast, a psychiatrist, and he talks
Mhm.
exactly about that and the role of testosterone and the whole feeling good about exactly as you said, poor people or rich people believing themselves to be superior and all that. Yeah, he has a great expose on this. If you want to have a look.
Yeah. So in terms of authoritarianism, what's the source? What causes authoritarianism? Why do people become authoritarian? The Freudian explanation is that their parents were cold, punishing, authoritarian themselves, strict, and so the child would get used to that. And so they'd look for that in their leaders because that's what they were used to. And while I'm sure that's in great part, there's not like a falsifiability to that.
Mm,
You can't really test it all that well. So what Bob Altmaier came to is that actually the leading predictor of authoritarianism is that you grew up in a house and you stayed in an environment that was fearful of a dangerous world. We haven't mentioned fear nearly enough. Fear
yeah.
is the most important human emotion. It is the strongest predictor that I can find of right-wing tendencies, of conservative tendencies, and part of this goes back to fear of change,
Mm,
right? Intolerance for ambiguity. There's a fear element to that because, well, if something's uncertain, it feels shaky, and fear of a dangerous world, fear that if there's more of those people, they'll gain power and then there will be chaos and anarchy and then I'm screwed. I'm going to be unsafe. Fear of a dangerous world. This is what makes people fall into the arms of an authoritarian more than any other subtype of fear or anxiety. Um, and despite the fact that people on the left will admit that they have more anxiety, I bet you if you were actually able to like get into people's brains, people on the right actually experience more anxiety.
mhm,
It's just because of the, shall we say, differences in emotional intelligence as they relate to self-awareness. I think people on the right are less self-aware of their fear, less self-aware about their anxiety, as well as they are motivated to not admit it because, come on, we associate fear with cowardice. We
yeah.
associate anxiety with weakness. Whether it's fair or not, that's what we do.
It puts you lower in the
And
hierarchy.
yeah, they just don't want to admit that they're those things. Because if you're weak, you're more vulnerable. And if you're vulnerable, you're in danger. Again, fear of a dangerous world. And
No,
one of
this
the
is
keys to
excellent.
with
So
one
sorry,
of the
sorry.
other
This is
oh
excellent because this well this interfaces right back into the whole evolutionary origins. Because if you live in a very desolate environment and you're at fear that every time another tribe might attack you, maybe you will do a preemptive attack. So fear breeds aggression, and this brings me also
yes.
back to what I wrote about the psychorealism, the paper. This is also at least it appears to me from the psychological point of view to be the whole reason behind the well, for example, the maximum pressure campaign against Iran, or for example, Condoleezza Rice saying if there's a 1% chance that they have a nuke, we have to attack them first. So there's a lot of fear in the neoconservative mindset, which is the one that I particularly had a look at. Just a subbreed of the whole conservatives. Sorry, I just wanted to interject that because it makes it makes perfect sense, which is a good indicator for a model that actually works. Right.
Fear is so key because fear is the baseline. Every animal has fear. It's the first emotion. Fear comes before love because fear is about survival. And there's a certain amount of fear that is reasonable. If you're afraid of climate change, you're a reasonable person, you know? If you're afraid that if you get sick in America, you're going to go bankrupt, that's a reasonable fear. And it should motivate us towards a more just society. It hasn't yet. Um, but dude, I mean, fear, we could literally spend the entire time talking about fear.
Well, let's do that. Let's talk. Well, let's do another episode where we talk about both fear and Yeah, my pen isn't working. And the other Pandora's box, which we mentioned, what was it? I'll look it up in the podcast because I have a
You'll
hard
figure it
stop.
out.
Yeah, we will figure it out. I have a hard stop approaching. And do you have anything else to add?
Yes, I wanted to add one more thing about authoritarianism. So there's something called social contact theory, which is the idea that it is one of the most tested ideas in all of social science. And it is that when you come into contact with different groups of people, you're going to be less prejudiced towards them because you understand them more, you see them as
Mm,
less different, and they're less scary because they're, you know, not the fear of the unknown is such a huge thing in the animal world that still remains in us. It's this evolutionary baggage weighing us down like an anchor. And so one of the keys to authoritarianism is growing up and staying in these insular communities of only people like them. That is a huge, huge key to authoritarianism, and it's a big reason why rural people are more conservative than people that live in cities. And the same goes for having a college education because you come into contact with adults, all sorts of different kinds of people.
mm. Amen. This is an excellent addition. Yeah. Well, with that, I would say thank you very much, Keegan. Um, let's do this again soon. Where can people follow you?
Yes, so I admit the best place is TikTok because I can actually earn money on my views and I do need to pay rent. TikTok at Keegan Tatum. And of course, if you're not on TikTok, don't fret. You can watch me on Instagram at Keegan Tatum. You can watch me on Facebook at Keegan Tatum, and you can watch me on YouTube at Keegan Tatum. If you pretty much type in hashtag political psychology, you'll come across some like long-haired dude wearing a turtleneck with the planet Earth in behind him, and that's me.
Awesome. Wait, does that make you the alien?
Yes. Yes, I bought this like at the very start, so I'm technically on the moon looking at the Earth. And I
Awesome.
just stuck with it because I like it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Keegan. Yeah, let's stay in touch, and I will let you know.
Mark, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.